both the site and the ideas that it has served to enable and embody. One aspect of why this becomes particularly pleasurable is the movement between interior and exterior spaces. There is the mediation continuously, because of the nature of these sites, of light and water. The continuous moving from the interior, darkened, often shabby, abandoned space into a particular quality of light, building a break from the relentless consumption, which is so often the deterministic itinerary in international huge exhibitions and biennales. Here one has always got a space to move out of the intensity of the sensation, the affect, the content of the particular artwork that you're engaging with, into a space which is an interface which never loses that embedding in sight, never loses its connection with the mnemonic device. Does this then constitute, across the multiple sites of the Kochi Muziris Biennale, an argument? I'm not sure it does, and I'm not sure that that's a problem. What happens is actually a kind of inference, a kind of deduction, a constellation of, as Rias began with, cosmopolitan expressions. However, cosmopolitanism, globalization, and the particular politics of the World Exhibition are somewhere contained within the historical site. It's when one leaves the sites that one encounters the tension of the new urbanization, the building of high-rises, modern advertising, and it seems to be an epicarp, a carapace that you must quickly traverse to get to the real mnemonic site. To think back to the first World Exhibition, the Great Exhibition of 1851, and to 1857, which is described as the first huge exhibition of fine art in the 19th century in the UK and maybe in the world. These, to my mind, represent forms of travel, where Asia, Africa, and the rest of the world, the rest from a Eurocentric, Euro-American-centric perspective, was represented through anthropological readings of cultures of the other. International art biennales located in the West, till very recently, did the same. In the recent period, we've seen significant shifts, both with the emergence and assertion of post-colonial biennales, resistance to this Euro-American hegemony, like Havana, and those located in Asia, starting, of course, with Gwangju in 1995. The emergence of these biennales actually is almost manifesto-like. They present manifestos, making specific arguments for why and the particular historical juncture that they represent. The Gwangju Manifesto, and I go to Gwangju because I think it is also interesting to read Kochi in the context of Asian biennales and to look at the shift in terms of critical discourse, cultural production, and the creation of new forms of discourse around cultural production that are emerging from within this geographical arena. The Gwangju Manifesto locates itself firmly within a political framework. It's initiated as commemorating the May 18th uprising, speaks of international cultural citizenship grounded in democracy. I quote from Okoyen Bizo's text. The inaugural exhibition was presented to more than 1 million visitors as part of a festival commemorating the courageous Gwangju citizens. Over the past decade, the Gwangju Biennale's critical experiment in the field of contemporary art has worked in tandem with the image of the city as a site of human rights and civil society. While the Biennale has had an impact in Asia, not the least of which is the attempt by other projects in South Korea and neighboring countries to replicate some of its curatorial ambitions and to emulate its example, its unique brand is its own. Perhaps the Gwangju Biennale is unique only in the manner that it ties to its brand. That it ties its brand not to the growth of Asia in the future, but by way of the link it makes to the uprising by using the spectacle of street protests as a symbol for establishing an open structure of cultural interaction. This is written in 2008 for the 7th Gwangju Biennale. The 9th Gwangju Biennale, which took place last year and which I was part of, actually really furthers this essential interest in engagement with the spectacle of protest. And of course, recent history has seen Arab Spring, Occupy, etc. So there is an engagement with particular political forms as significant to cultural production and is brought into the discourse around the creation of the Biennale and is seen as quite central to it. I found it very interesting to see in Riaz's presentation the constant iteration of the street protest or the jalsa, which was evoked both in Thank You and We're Waiting for 2014 to other. There were several processional forms within that presentation which struck me as quite interesting because as a flaneur moving through the Biennale, this was a register, this was a note that actually was not explicitly struck, which I find particularly interesting considering the political history of Kerala, the cultural political history of Kerala, and the cultural political history of the two artistic directors. However, if we go back to the idea of travel, of biennales actually being forms of travel, whether in terms of imaginary voyages enabled by the encounter with the works, or whether the physical materiality of actual travel. So you have three kinds of travel that take place when you go to the Kochi Biennale. There is the actual physical travel, which not only you make, but many others are making for reasons which may not be particular to the Biennale, but have meant the actual physical movement of a body in space. The travel or the imaginary voyages enabled, occasioned, invited by the works themselves, and the potential to travel beyond location to place-bound locals. If we read biennales as forms of voyaging into imaginary worlds, do they then create imagined communities? Are we then looking at some kind of notion of transcultural, inverted commas, nations, which while being embedded and structured by the nation state, where the patronage need, for their own reasons, whether simple patronage, need for cultural capital, tourism, etc., what then are we constellating in terms of this imaginary travel, imaginary community, and I return to the metaphor of the mnemonic device. What is it that we seek to remember? Parallel to this is a kind of travel that we're all involved with, which is curiously, again, unregistered within the Kochi Biennale, which is voyaging within the internet. The internet today is as much a site of imaginary journeys and imaginary travel as any other. And there are today emerging biennales which are on site. So I'm positioning this against the great pleasure of the great materiality and physicality of the Kochi Musris Biennale. Not to argue against it, but to actually locate it within these multiple ways of enabling travel. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Geeta. Generous invitation. Thank you, JNU. It's a pleasure to be here. You use the word humility often in your presentation, Riaz. I think many of us who came to Kochi were humbled by the generosity and the breadth of the vision. It was a great pleasure. Geeta's invitation to speak was of oneself in the role of the flaneur passing through the city of Kochi and certainly of Fort Kochi. I'm going to take a step back and speak today as a critic and speak not of Kochi as a site, but as a site for Kochi, the locating of Kochi. And part of this is informed by my brief work with them in setting up a sort of set of ideas for the seminar practice, but also Kochi today and looking into Kochi of the future. And yes, I should confess that my paper is informed by the idea of two artists who work very hard and are still in debt. I found this interesting, this circuit of ideas, the solidity and assuredness and wealth of Documenta, the willing energies of Sharjah, and Kochi's invitation to a certain extent, but it's also an evocation of euphoria, but the sharp realization of its fragility and its vulnerability. I would like to speak of sight and its imaginaries, sight and space as two separate categories, and a sense of the politics of the space and its further trajectories. Now, if we see Kochi as a biennale determined by geography, a biennale determined by the artist as activist entrepreneur, and its illumination of South Asia, which is otherwise perhaps a pool of darkness on this global circuit of biennales, then we see Kochi as an absolute act of affirmation, one that projects into the future. There's a Newsweek article on the KMB, December 17, where a Malayali architect, Benny Kyriakos, is quoted as saying that if KMB was managed properly, it would do for Kerala what Athens had done for Greece. Here, the imaginary offers a utopian vision of great cultural authority. So Kochi was thus poised to become the newest in a line of biennales from the south. We know that possibly the idea of the Southern Biennale is 1955 with Alexandria, which set out to fulfill Arab ambition. And Southern Biennales have then set out several scales of political trajectory. How do we define the Southern perspective? And let's play out some of its potential sites. Ghulam Sheikh and Geeta has generously shared this, has referred to the Biennale as peninsula. I would like to expand this reading of Kochi's attempt to open up a new frontier, perhaps for the South. Biennales on the Edge, or a view of biennales from southern perspectives by Anthony Gardner, offers two kinds of biennale models. There are the biennales are bad model. This is the biennale that is coming directly from Venice, which has its roots in the 1890s, the biennales of the North, biennales of wealth built on colony and empire, swimming into neoliberal capitalism, certainly global excess, and in their sweep and embrace, sweeping along the post-colonial with art as manifestation in passing. This is the biennales as bad. But there's the biennales as good model, which goes back not to the 1890s, but to 1989, which we use Magicians de la Terre, perhaps controversially, but perhaps it is a good suggestion. Rashid Arin's The Other Story, also of 1989, as a point of critical departure. These are biennales of hope, biennales that become markers of social and political change, the biennales of the South. I think this is a natural habitation for Kochi. But then there is another marker I would like to suggest, and that is, of course, the Indian Triennale of 1968 and its subsequent failures. What Kochi leaves curatorially unstated, and this is something that is always in the back, but we haven't completely articulated it, or it is curatorially included perhaps, but embedded through implication is, of course, post-colonialism, histories of the North, the politics of the South. It also marks distance. Distance from the framing European model, but also from the center, the Indian Triennale. It marks some distance from the paternalistic state as patron, though not completely. Of the patron existing outside the system and displaying an indifference to the Biennale as a site for critical progress. This was certainly the model of the Indian Triennale, state as patron, but completely indifferent to its critical progress. Now, in this biennales are good, biennales are bad argument, Kochi did not even try to engage. But I think what it did do was it softened Okwi Envisor's critique of the numbing logic of spectacular capitalism, his reading of the Biennale of the North, through an unstated amorphous poetics, glancing at the mists of the past, but never in very specific terms. I wonder how many of us actually visited Muziris, bothered to join the entities on both sides of the hyphen, Kochi and Muziris. So in its non-metropolitan, partially global, part state-funded, local global mix, the Kochi Biennale does two or three things. It's not an act of erasure, as was Documenta, which comes on the heels of German history and wants to build upon it, but posits itself as a more competent, and then, of course, Documenta posits itself as a competent competitor to Venice, Kochi vertically excavates a past without absolute definitions and horizontally spreads out again without definitive borders. Coming at this point in our history, it evades or sidesteps the pervading shadow of the post-colonial, what the Chilean curator Beatriz Rustos has called the link of our shared tragedies, to create instead a ground of the new, a possibility of transcendence from the sites which we normally inhabit. Do we then have a biennale which refuses to align, making a case neither for one or the other extreme? I would argue here for a genuine non-alignment, and whose primary purpose is reimagining the regional. In effect, Kochi not only lights up South Asia, it also affirms a long list of biennales set up from the 50s, Alexandria to Columbia, which soften and deflect the contours of both the North and the South, and which did in fact foster and grow precisely in this spirit of the non-aligned. I use the word the non-aligned rather than non-alignment. This is not the political non-alignment, but non-alignment as a case for distance. And this is deliberate because we know that Nasser in Egypt with the Alexandria Biennale, Tito in Yugoslavia used the Biennale structure with a political intention of non-alignment. This is a case of being non-aligned and moving away to a much more individualistic position. But let us come back to another aspect of the Southern Biennale. For any of us who say editing a survey of contexts, Shivji Panikkar is here and will agree with me, of specific histories of modern Indian art, this history of the South, even post-1947, has appeared turgid, somewhat isolated from the national mainstream. E.S. Raman, a former editor of the Illustrated Weekly, noted that the South's modernities were not noted because it lacked a cosmopolitan culture, a cosmopolitan press rather, and this is where Bombay scored in being able to foster a modern art movement because it was able to lend articulation, create publics, and a critical discourse. What we have in the Kochi Biennale is in the presence of its curators, one, certainly the emphasis on the cosmopolitan, and a reverse migration of metropolitan sensibilities to a ground fertile in its innocence, gaining authority and valence due to state and critical absence. A ground rendered ambiguous, perhaps even romantic, by heterogeneous tempos and mixed temporalities, but also because of an absence of articulation. Such a site with all its challenges, one may well ask, why would the curators want to engage with the narration of time and the poetics of territory? I think this is because the Kochi Biennale registers omission, historic omission. We know that the opposing group famously spoke of the curators as outsiders. The rhetorical question in return would be, can a Biennale and its site imaginaries be owned? In this free-floating and then the coming together of the site and its imaginaries, one can think of Kochi as the newest among the migratory cultural ideas of our time. And certainly modern India has built upon these blocks of cultural ideas of the migratory as a site of extreme cultural volatility and productivity. One of the best examples would be the migration from the Urdu heartland of Lahore and UP to Bombay, 40s, 50s, 60s, the absolute unleashing of the Muslim social, the Muslim historical, which writers like, gosh, I'm forgetting his name, but I'll just give it to you, they have argued about the Muslim social as a counter to Indian nationalism, as a successful counter to Indian nationalism. So even when wars with Pakistan are being waged, it is the success of the run of the Muslim social which gives you a counter to the nationalist spirit. And now 50 years later, the absolute exodus perhaps of cheap labor from UP and Bihar creates an overlayer, another layer of the accretion on the early migratory spirit, and in turn gives enormous ground for the cinema of crime coming from the Hindi heartland. In a state with as volatile a history as the movement of Kerala, the Kochi Biennale, I think, marks the possibility of migration as cultural aesthetic. It is in a sense a homecoming, a reverse migration, and it marks the rejection of the metropolis as the site of the Biennale. Working on the content of the Kochi Biennale, as I did, lays bare some 2 or 3 potential questions, and I think I'd like to mark them here. And it's interesting that Shiba has just flagged them. Now, is the Asian critical space a more natural habitation for Kochi? This is a question that we have to ask ourselves. Does one limit oneself to Asia out of a sense of modesty? Or is there a transcultural dialogue through the logics of space So is it more natural, say, to construct a dialogue between Gwangju or the West Heavens Project and Kochi, or is this a bigger arena? Or does Kochi signal by its very presence the irrelevance of an Indian dialogue, even within the context of the global? I'm the last speaker of the evening, and I'm nearly at the end of my presentation. So, in response to the concerns around Kochi and its excruciating vulnerabilities, I want to make a proposition, and that is the proposition of survival. Now, can the Kochi Biennale survive in Kochi? Can the Kochi Biennale survive outside Kochi? As the Kochi Bhubaneswar Biennale, the Kochi Mumbai Biennale, and I dare say even the Kochi Ahmedabad Biennale, before it can return at will to Kochi museums. I name these as possibilities of an itinerant biennale, drawing from the great strengths of Kochi: restoration, revitalization, and a remapping of space. Here, Kochi can provide a template of knowledge, a roadmap of the pitfalls that lie ahead. And if debt is a natural outcome of art, then let it be an itinerant debt. A promiscuous debt, if you like, a national debt, debt driven by a curatoriate of artists where the emphasis is on a refusal to allow cities, their cultures, and their institutions to die, which allows political consciousness of the elsewhere to penetrate and enrich the local fabric. India, with her 1,000 or 1,500 museums, can play host to an itinerant biennale with a transformative authority, should we agree. A biennale which moves away before it exhausts and eviscerates the very ground from which it has sprung. Thank you.
Wind this up and close it as a GNU. Questions, comments? It's been a long day, I know, but I think that this session has raised a huge number of questions, desires, comments, critiques, and if there are any that you would like to foreground, please take it. Yes, Kavita.
If I could, Riaz, I'd like to start by telling you how much I admired the Kochi Biennale. When I visited it, it was truly moving, remarkable achievement, even without the backstory that we hear, which makes it all the more heroic, truly against all odds. So congratulations and thank you for it. And all of the panelists have spoken wonderfully, but Gayatri, you gave us an incredible note to end on, and I actually want to question the kind of exhilaration that you produced in us at that moment with your flourish of a traveling debt, because the way you said it actually was like an exhortation which created a sense of excitement and participation, but actually isn't it a matter of shame? Isn't it a matter of shame that we should be in this situation, that you understand that an enterprise like this is going to be mired in this manner and will produce the kind of frictions and resistances that it has?
The shame as it is in front of us. We are witness, we are participant, but we can't collaborate in the shame. I think the greatest shame would be the demise of a biennale. There are, Venice, for instance, has a very high record of participants from other countries, which then fall off the map. We are probably one of them ourselves. But this, the perpetuity of a mistake. So the 2-year, and perhaps Riaz may be better to answer this, but the very structure of the Biennale of 2 years puts enormous pressure to recover existing debts and raise money, plus all the infrastructure that goes with it. But if you have a series of cities with existing structures, perhaps greater willingness, perhaps governments which are more generous in their approach, perhaps with less skewed cultural policies, I think, but then the hyphenation must exist. It must be the Kochi Bhubaneswar. It must be something that has a primary belonging here. I'm really
How does
throwing
Riaz
it at
feel about this?
Yeah, I think the debt has several reasons to it, I think. I mean, that's why it's still continuing to be a kind of a bigger problem. So I think we still hope that, we'll be able to kind of sort it out. But I think, Gayatri's proposition, I find it as a kind of success of the biennial, the proposition coming, because that's what one of the intention of the project was also, to send the message of Kochi and Musris, much, farther to kind of reach out. So I think I kind of, take that as a kind of compliment that there is, such ideas getting evoked. It's not just because of that we are in debt. I think the Biennale has created that sense of, meaning to it.
I just want to mention here that the Arab Biennale, the first solid Arab Biennale of Alexandria was itinerant biennale and went from Arab city to Arab city. And now we can see a sense of its gestalt in terms of the great lateral spread that's grown.
I also want to think about debt differently. I don't see why it should be a matter of shame. I think it actually embodies, makes visible what happens with the arts, what happens with cultural policy, and that it can become almost like a flag to be waved and maintained as part of the discursive, critical thinking around biennales as such. So the fact that it has a debt can become part of the articulation of biennale itself. Why don't we actually take it as a flamboyant gesture that the biennale carries as part of its very nature? Countries survive, continue with huge national debts. We don't seem to hang our heads in shame over that. We can't be neat corporate people with the books balanced at the end of a successful show.
These are two or three very provocative and very generative propositions. Would somebody want to take these up or others up?
No, I'm just saying, I agree with this. But, Manifesto went bankrupt. And the thing is that I think one should not, I'm afraid of it becoming a rhetorical frame. The reason is that it is a real form within which it is produced. So the debt, manifesto debt, was actually overcome by a lot of artists who have become quite famous, like Marlene Dumas, giving a lot of the artwork without naming it as a public auction, giving it the sale money. Not sale, they're giving the sale money to it. Like giving it, like you sell it, take the money, don't make it a public auction, because in an auction, the character of the Biennale will be attacked. And Kerala, they will just destroy it. So you don't, so I think there are ways in which you produce different forms within which you relate to debt. And I think I will just differentiate between national debt. There is no national debt, anything is called national debt. It is state debt. It is state debts. And state debts are... No, the state wants to think as national debt. It produces the we when it is in trouble. But it's a state debt. It's a state debt.
It's a state debt, but the sources of money are either from the Ministry of Culture or from the...
No. Countries other than India.
No, national debt. I think when we say the national... Yeah, globally, we should think as a state, as an institution, produces a debt. It wants a certain kind of heightened business opportunity in its environment. It is producing the discourse of debt. Japan has 250% debt, and Greece has 67. They're dolmaring on Greece. There must be some reason. So, and I think, so we should make the debt a more interesting proposition and make artists move around it. I'm just I'm just adding to it. I'm just not.
I think from what I know, the word cultural capital was not fully used by Riaz, because I think that the enterprise of both the Biennale, and he suggested all the other things that happened, and the fact that he has sown seeds, not only in the town but in other parts of Kerala, of an art exhibition that generates not only ideas, but about the city, about education, about ecology. I think that the people want that part to live on as well in this period, apart from whatever will come 2 years later. I'm not fully in agreement about this thing traveling, because unless you have your house in order, only then you can start exporting your goods elsewhere. And actually it is Chris Durkin who happened to have met our culture minister in London. And you know, he's a great supporter of the Biennale. And he told her, Madam, the Kochi Biennale is not a state cultural activity. It is a national activity. And it is your duty to support this Biennale. So she said, yes, that's a good point. So I think that maybe this is a very important meeting that we've had. But I don't know in what way one can expand this or actually take this to the state, to the center. There are different institutions like the National Cultural Fund, which also can, once they are approached in time, but also the ministry, that this must continue. I think that some of you know, I tried to start, or we tried to start a Delhi Biennale, but this has already shown that it has, at so many levels, the site itself, when Riaz showed it to me, I said, half your Biennale is made. So I think we have to continue, and if we can organize something to bring this and start pay the debts and start collecting the funds, that it has to continue in Kochi for many years to come.
I feel the story of the debt came back to kind of a main discourse because of last week's intervention by one of the artists. But what we've been having a very direct communication with this current government. There is, as you see, that any new project which is taken up by a new government which was initiated by a previous one, there is always political hindrances. But what the fascinating aspect about this government was that they were ready to look at this project through a different eye. They did a cultural audit. That was one of the most fascinating things, which is something which is not in our policies.
What is it, cultural audit?
Yeah, they literally did a cultural audit. Their order says, look at this Biennale aesthetically. They've used that word. And, consider this project. And they all came. Most of the ministers came, all the, the officers came, all the people from the culture department came. And it is, I think it has passed. That, it has its merit, it's proved it. But it's all because of that, I think, now I feel, it's because of the legal system, where they could make again inroads to kind of block this. So I think there is problem with the system which we operate any kind of cultural projects.
I'd just like to briefly add to what Vivan said. It was in my presentation, but I left it out. What I noticed and was impressed by in Kochi was the engagement of the local community, of a very wide and diverse kinds of people, audiences. And what I saw in Gwangju, which is now in its 9th iteration, was a sense of ownership of the Biennale. While I would say there would still be lacunae in terms of the modes of relation to the Biennale amongst the local people, it is something that they're extremely proud of and have a pretty good measure of. So this is something that has built over time, that sense of engagement and actually public ownership, which I'm just adding to what Vivan said.
Is there a question there? 2 questions, and maybe if there isn't anybody, and should that 3 questions, and we...
If you could just talk a little bit about the entire branding aspect of the exhibition, because it's somehow, for some reason, it's not being talked about, and I think it's a very integral part of the equity it's generated, because the fact, I think that's part of why one can imagine taking making it a Kochi Ahmedabad is the kind of sort of entire personality that it's developed because of the entire branding that's happened around it. And like a simple question like, will your debt now allow you to adhere to those kinds of fundamental brand guidelines, and how is that going to work in the future with your debt? And how do you think that'll affect? And I know branding is a bad word in that sense, but I think it's a very important part of why Kochi Biennale is the way it is, amongst lots of things.
How would you like to define the word branding in your use? I mean, not its pejorative use, but how are you using it?
Well, the entire identity that's been created around it, apart from the physical experience, I haven't been there myself, but
through the graphic design.
I mean, the entire experience along with the spaces and the works, but everything else, all other interfaces that create a sense of the Kochi Biennale. Everything from typography to signage to the beginning of the film, the logo that comes. There's serious guidelines that are in place that's very visible, and that's part of why it comes across as so sophisticated. And that's one of the reasons why, apart from the material physical space in Cochin, I would imagine, what's also creating the sense of the Cochin Biennale is a very sophisticated identity creating.
It's minimal, compared to what happens around the world. It's very sophisticated. It's working on poverty. It's not working on.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, but I can tell you it's.
Can I?
Yeah, it's working. Is all I'm saying.
Yeah.
But it's not. It seems like when something like that works, it looks like it's simple and it can just keep working on its own. But it needs a lot of effort and a lot of money to keep that going, to keep those guidelines going.
I would say that it was designed well. Because we are artists and we had a team in place. I think we should go into such kind of.
The branding? I'm just asking, did WK have anything to do with the branding?
No.
Why
This, for example, the logo was done by a guy from Bombay. Which is done the initial months, which was based on the concept which we had given to them, that make it something which looks like a kind of confluence of different cultures. So he came up, he delivered quite well. Then we had a designer, Latish, who's also worked with Wyden and Kennedy sometime before. But I think it's also because we are artists. We were quite, we've given a little bit more. We have looked at those aspects, and it's visible. And I think that's it. I think it's a first project. And the Kochi and Muziris has to be kind of spell out quite well. I feel, I actually take this as a kind of a good observation from your side, because, a lot of people have told us that your branding was quite good. That it conveyed the message.
I thought the good thing was that it was basic.
I am studying in School of Arts and Aesthetics, and I am from Kochi. And so that reason I am very cynical, and I am very proud of that. Actually, my doubt is that being superficial is the necessary condition of the artworks to get selected in the Biennale. Because for the foreign artists, even they exhibit their work of art, if it is about the local history of this place, then obviously it has to be superficial. Because coming from foreign places, they won't be able to make any concrete comment on it. And if they work on their own historical situations, for the local spectator, they won't be able to make a critical comment on these works, which is completely distant from their own immediate reality. And if for the local artists, obviously they won't be able to make any concrete critical statements, because after all, it will challenge the state support. And obviously, this is not something that we want to happen. So I have substantiated this point with a reference to Vivan Sundaram's work. Because being a student of art history, I have studied Vivan Sundaram as very few Marxist artists we have, and who was very partisan about all the cultural issues. And he right now also he repeated that thing. But when looking at his work, Black Gold, is it just a simulation of a kind of a cultural landscape that is already circulating in the popular psyche of like all of us in the world, like because it's so flattened in the literal sense?